Welcome to the July 7th, 2015 regular Salem City Council meeting. It will now come to order. We'll have the invocation given by Steve Faber of our Parks Department, and if you would remain standing at that time for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're grateful that you've put us in this time and this place. Father, we're grateful that you've given to us the power to investigate and to reason, and Father, help us to understand that we can agree to disagree as long as we do it honorably and kindly. Thank you for giving us the gifts that you have beyond that. Thank you for each citizen that's in this community, that we might know the blessings that come from you and come from knowing each other and serving each other. We pray, Father, that you would bless the events of this week, that the weather would be kind to us, and we don't think it always has, but we're asking for kind weather this week. Father, thank you for hearing us and allowing us to have the opportunity to ask you that. Father, we know that you don't make mistakes and you'll always do what's right. We ask you to be in this meeting tonight, that you would be present as we make decisions, and that you would guide and direct those that are going to make those votes, because they have been given the power by the citizens, that it's their job now to represent them. Thank you, Father, for all these gifts, for the kindness that you give to each of us, for the kindness and the health that you give to each citizen in this community and beyond. Thank you for being our friend and for your love that never ends. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk pro tem, please call the roll.
Mr. Brown?
Present.
Mr. Cushman?
Here.
Mrs. Dickey?
Here.
Mr. Drummond?
Here.
Mr. Paparotis?
Here.
I'm here. Mr. Nestic?
Motion, Mr. Brown. Is there a motion?
Yeah. I can't talk. But yeah, I'd make the motion. Or second the motion, whatever.
Excuse Mr. Nestic.
Yes, please.
Second from Mr. Drummond. Clerk pro tem, please call the roll.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Nestic is excused. Everyone's received a copy of the minutes from the June 16th, 2015 meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to those minutes? Mr.
I
Brown?
didn't get a copy, but I would like one in my mailbox next week someday.
We will see that you get that.
Thank you.
Seeing that there are no additions, corrections, or deletions, the minutes stand as approved. There are no petitions and remonstrances this evening. We'll move on to receiving of visitors. Rob Johnson, Bike Week.
Good evening, everybody. I felt it only appropriate to come before you before the Bike Week, which starts Thursday. You guys, many months ago, had a meeting of the whole, give me the vote of confidence, a unanimous vote of confidence to do this. And I felt it only right to step before you tonight. Let you know, I've got committees in place. I've got everything 99.9% buttoned down. Things will occur we're not planned for. We don't have the experience of the car cruise people, and we'll learn from it every year as we go forward. I've done a ton of work for this. I've had a great group of people come on board and help me. I could stand up here all night and tell you their names and what they've done. I won't do that. But I have to say, I was a little shaken by the article today, and I could only see a portion of it. So I actually, Marianne, I subscribed to the Salem News this morning and got to read the whole article. And I've had many communications with the chief since I started this, as I have with Betty from the auditor's office, Debbie Bricker. I almost put a tent in her office. And I, at first, was taken by that article, and then I realized, well, I need to look at it through someone else's glasses. The chief has a job to do, and I support the chief. Now, is he preparing for the worst? Yes. Do I feel the worst is coming? Absolutely not. I was in Sandusky 3 weeks ago for Bike Week, took a friend of mine up there, had never been to a bike event. On the way home, I said, "What'd you think?" And she said it was pretty much a fair with beer and bands. I said, "Yeah, that's how bike weeks are." And, you know, there's events going on throughout the downtown. But I have to say, I respect the chief, and I think what he's doing is commendable. He has to look at it in a different light than all of us. You guys don't even have to be in town for it if you don't want to. I do, and he does, of course. I am having a little get-together. The mayor's going to speak at 5 o'clock on Thursday, just to welcome everybody. Reverend Bob from the Catholic Church will do a blessing of the bikes. And I ask that any of you, because all of you in this room have had a hand on that bike event in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, from asking Ken questions and not knowing answers and having to call him, you're all welcome there. I'd like to get anybody that has a nickel in this together at 4:30. And I just go around and thank everybody, and I'll have my group there as well. Is there any questions for me? Okay, I'll be glad to stay till after and answer anything that might come to mind. Thank you very much for your support, and I hope for good weather. Thank you for the little prayer. We need it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rob. Scott Cahill, subject dogs and taxes.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mayor. One thing, I had taken a position on the drug dogs earlier, and I've done some research. I talked to the prosecutor. I've talked to some police people, and I've changed my position on the drug dogs. I believe that they would be very effective if used properly. The concerns I had regarding the Supreme Court rulings of 2010 and 2015 have been allayed by the county prosecutor, who assures me that the methodologies employed would not be contradictory to the decisions of the Supreme Court. And I therefore support the drug dogs. I do not support incorporation of the cost of the drug dogs into an anticipated increase in the tax, though. But the subject of us having drug dogs, I support wholeheartedly. Regarding the tax, I support the 0.25% increase in the tax, and I intend to petition strongly to get a good base of support to move that forward here in our city. But I can only do that with a 5-year sunset. My reasoning is this. I believe that in our projections and my projections, that within 5 years we can increase the tax base sufficiently to compensate the difference in an increased tax base. And indeed, that is the only way, ladies and gentlemen, that we work our way out of this. There is no way to work our way out of this by increasing taxation. There is no way that we can work our way out of this without providing services or by cutting them back. So I strongly support the 0.25% increase in the income tax with a 5-year sunset. And I am not able to support it without that 5-year sunset, because I desperately want the opportunity in 5 years to look at it and be able to make ourselves as competitive as we can as a city after that time. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Lisa Cahill, Super Cruise, I think it says.
That handwriting's a little bit of a challenge sometimes, isn't it? I'm familiar. I got a few handouts. I don't have enough, so hopefully you all will be kind enough to share. I'm happy to send you the list. What you see on top is a list of the people who paid money to have booths at Super Cruise. And this is obtained from Betty in a Freedom of Information Act request. The notes down at the bottom are my own. Missing from the paid list, but set up and selling, was the International Hose Club. We went over and asked them. They said no, they don't pay the $500. They donate something to the food bank. Eurogyro, who said that he didn't have to pay the $500. He got a health department permit for $83, I believe. And then there was a vape stand set up at Pershing and Lincoln in the white barber shop's parking lot. And it was only set up one night, so I can see how it could have been missed. But it's a little bit curious because last year, in our same parking lot, we set up a bouncy house and used it to attract people to come in and get familiar with our development. So I went to Mr. Kent's beforehand, knowing that the ordinance was fairly complicated to understand, and I asked him what I needed to do. And let me backtrack a little bit and explain that we set up a stand selling coffee and snow cones this year, and were visited Thursday night and told we had to pay $500, although this is owned property that we own, real estate that we actually own. And then Friday morning, I guess, the police came and forced Cammie to shut her snow cone stand down. So in 2014, if you look on the page following, I have a little transcript of a conversation that I had with Mr. Kent's where I asked him, what do we need to do? Because it's our property, we're gonna set this thing up, so what do I need to do in order to do it legally and correctly? And I'm going to play, I think I got it queued up to about the right point, so I'm gonna play the last paragraph, which is larger.
Churches, people want to have a garage sale on State Street.
Uh-huh.
That's their personal property, they can do what they want.
Okay.
This is your property, so you can do what you want.
Okay.
So that's not a problem.
Okay, good, well,
But I'm just saying,
I
my
read
only
the-
concern would be the pedestrian traffic.
Okay. I read the, the code and the
Yeah.
spot permits and all this stuff. So what's different between 2014 and 2015? It's not the laws, they haven't changed. I don't know if you remember this, but in 2014, Mr. Herron ran into some problems couple weeks after the Super Cruise. He was continuing to be open, and he was made to close by the city. So I think it's kind of interesting that he didn't have a problem in the world this year, having been very vocally supportive of the administration recently. But we, who had been told, this is your property, you can do what you want, seem to have some trouble this year, although nothing had changed except perhaps some of our comments not being 100% supportive. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Brett, can I ask a
Cindy.
question of Mrs. Cahill?
That's fine.
Who approached you on Thursday night originally?
Thursday night, it was Mick who coordinates the vendors for the event.
Okay, because I would like to comment that I did personally, at the request of the Cahills and the employee who was going to be doing the sales, call Mr. Kent and ask specifically if they needed to pay the fee, and also was told that they did not. So it's kind of disturbing that they had purchased their materials and set up and paid an employee to sell these things, and then were unable to do it for the entire event. That's not a real good thing to do to our businesses.
Okay. Anything further?
Nope, that's it.
That concludes the visitors this evening. Move on to report of city officials. Mayor Berlin.
Thank you, Mr. President and City Council. I would like to thank all the city departments that played a role in setting up, cleaning up, tearing down, or providing safety for this year's Salem Super Cruise. A special thanks goes to Arby's Cruising Crew Gene Johnson for handling logistics in a professional way again this year. Gene's wife even helped early on by calling on advertisers for this year's brochure and increasing participation in the publication. Speaking for all of us in the city, I want to recognize the Chamber of Commerce's Beautification Committee, headed up by Karen Carter. They once again made downtown come alive with flowers and plantings enjoyed by city residents and our visitors. I also thank all the sponsors, advertisers, and the hundreds of participants for making this year's cruise a success, even though we were not blessed with the best of weather. We had a dry day for the July 4th fireworks this year. A sign in front of City Hall has been put up to recognize all businesses, groups, and individuals who helped make the fireworks possible with their donations. We are still receiving some donations and will present a final list to the media for a thank you to them in a press in a press release this coming Monday. I want to thank Auditor Brothers for coming up with financing alternatives for several items which were presented to the Finance Committee, which will make it possible to move forward with the Summer Streets repaving program for 2015. Please plan on attending this year's first edition of the Salem Bike Weekend, starting this Thursday and ending on Sunday. A lot of work has been put into making this a successful event. We just need some cooperation from the weatherman. I would like to wish Pat Morrissey a happy and healthy retirement from the Housing Planning and Zoning Office and welcome his replacement, Zach Cowan. Pat has agreed to help in the transition. Finally, I wish a belated 85th happy birthday to Louis Dowd. He has been a faithful attendee at many committee and city council meetings over the years. I appreciate his interest in city government. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Any questions for the mayor? Seeing none. Assistant Law Director have anything this evening?
Have no report, thank you.
Right. Auditor, Mrs. Brothers.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of council, Mayor Berlin. The first thing I want to go over is the appropriation ordinance. The very bottom one where it says the sum of to purchase, that needs to be crossed out. That was a leftover from the last appropriation ordinance that we had, so that's, and I believe Mr. Cushman is going to amend that when it's his turn. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the ordinance that you have in front of you for the note from utilities for $100,000 for us to purchase the 2.5-ton truck. I didn't know if anybody had any questions, but the language is a standard language. We're looking at this for 5 years at a 1.75% interest rate, which will go to the utility department. If we went on outside to a bank, the lowest we could get there was 2%, so this is actually a win-win for the city. We can get the truck at a lower interest rate. And the last thing I have is to remind everybody that July 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning at Waterworth Park, we will have a citywide auction. So if anybody's interested to come out and purchase a street light or something like that, but it'll be July 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's all I have.
Any questions? Mr. Drummond.
Do you participate with the law director in drafting that note ordinance?
That actually came from our bond council.
Okay. Can you make a note for possibly future use that it refers to various sections and there's nothing indicating what those sections are in this ordinance?
Okay.
Like it says see section 4, see section 9, and I don't know where that is. I'm not a lawyer or a bond counsel or an auditor, so.
Anything further for Mrs. Brothers?
Thank you.
Safety Service Director, Mr. Kentz.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mayor Berlin, and members of council. I have no formal report this evening, but I'm sure Mr. Brown may have some comments. So, but I do feel I need to respond to Mrs. Cahill. In the 4 years that I've been involved with the cruise, nothing has changed the way I treat everybody. I can give you examples, the Hose Club, Faith Chapel, all these people that operate on their own property and the profit is for them, they're more than welcome to do it. My intent is for local businesses to do well on the cruise. The issue with Mrs. Franson's is that she owns that concession stand, not the Cahill, so it's not their benefit. They don't own that. The same situation happens on the Masonic Temple. We have 3 concession stands over there that they pay the city the same fee as the concession stands on Broadway. So they don't have to, they pay it twice, but they don't own it. But Masonic Temple could say, well, it's our property, we can do what we want. Well, that's not how the ordinance is interpreted. Again, the 4 years I've been doing it, nobody's questioned it. We have exceptions all over town. The Methodist Church operates some benefits. They did not this year, but they have in the past. And like I said, we encourage people to, basically, if you want to set up a shop outside your store and sell stuff there, it's like the old type Jubilee. It's the same situation. But that situation, and again, when I talked to Mrs. Cahill last year, that bounce house was on their property, it was for their income, and I saw no reason for the city to have any direct purpose in that. So glad to answer any questions.
Any questions from council?
Not tonight.
Mrs. Dickey?
You know, they did, Mrs. Franson and the Cahills did tell me what happened, really first Mrs. Franson, but she is their employee, and they were just using, is what I was told, just using her booth and selling their iced coffee and some snow cones too, but it was very clearly, they said, signed to say their tavern and the Courtyard Coffee House, the whole works. And it's not that she was there on her own, she was there as their employee.
Would all the profits on the tropical snow go to?
I don't know that,
That's what I'm
but
saying. So that was our interpretation of it. But again, that's the only situation that's come up. The other ones, and again, Eurogyro, he's operating on his property, and he's going to have a business there eventually, and so he pays his annual fee for that.
Anything further?
Question.
Mr. Whitehill?
Just to see whether I'm following this correctly. So for example, if they had leased that equipment for the weekend, then it would have been clear for sure?
If who would have leased it?
If the Cahills would have leased that equipment that was being used, would that have cleared that as their for-profit sale?
I don't know. I'd probably have to review it at the time.
Okay.
But in the past, I know Camille, and I know that that's her privately owned concession trailer, so.
Any other questions from council?
No worries.
Thank you. Utilities, Mr. Weingart.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, honorable mayor, I have no report but to say that the commission will meet Thursday, July 16th at 4 p.m. Please, call it, please.
Any questions for Mr. Weingart? Seeing none, thank you. Parks, Mr. Faber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening, but I'll be glad to answer questions you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Faber? Mr. Drummond?
Yes. Yes, we got the votes. They've been there for a week.
Very good. Any other questions for Mr. Faber? Seeing none, thank you.
You're welcome.
Move on then to report of standing committees. Finance, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Finance Committee did meet on July 1st here in council chambers. Committee members Dave Nestick, Brian Whitehill were present, as well as Mayor Berlin, Auditor Brothers, Safety Service Director Ken Kent, Streets Department Foreman Jim Phillis. The agenda items were purchase and financing of a new plow truck for the Streets Department. A City Hall roofing update was provided. Discussion to increase vehicle registration permissive tax. Ohio Public Works Commission grants and low or interest-free loans. And we approved an appropriations ordinance which included, among other things, authorizing $500,000 for the streets program this year. Further detail, the dump plow truck, Jim Phillis reviewed estimates from 3 dealers and recommended purchasing a 2.5-ton international dump truck snowplow from OS Hill in East Liverpool and using Gled Hill Road Machinery for the snowplow equipment and accessories. OS Hill is approved under the state purchasing program. The total purchase price for the plow and equipment is $124,953. Discussion then turned to possibly financing the purchase, and Auditor Brothers briefed the committee on her talks with the Utilities Commission to borrow the money at a 1.75 interest rate for 5 years, with the opportunity that they would have to review the interest rate after 3 years. She said the commission was scheduled to discuss this at their next meeting, and the decision will be made. The 1.75 interest rate was lower than the closest bank offer of 2%, as Auditor Brothers alluded to moments ago. Incidentally, the Utilities Commission has met since we have had our meeting and have approved that. Mrs. Brothers further informed the committee that there's $30,000 left over from the funds appropriated for the road salt, which could be applied toward the purchase of the truck, reducing the amount to be financed. The committee made the decision to approve the truck purchase if the Utilities Commission approved lending the money. Mr. Nestick made the motion with a second from Mr. Whitehill. It passed unanimously and is before you tonight. City Hall roofing update. The roof on the City Hall is failing and needs replaced. I bet if we were up there now, we could all prove it. Mr. Kent sought committee approval for an engineer to put a bid package together. The committee agreed to appropriate $110,000 from the general fund to the City Hall fund toward that. A motion was made by Mr. Whitehill, seconded by Mr. Nestick, and passed unanimously. That is before you tonight. Vehicle registration permissive use tax. Mrs. Brothers informed the committee that the city can increase the vehicle registration fee to generate more revenue for the street department. Currently, the city receives $7.50 per registration, and last year that generated almost $84,000. Increasing the registration fee would increase the money coming into the streets program. Mayor Berlin supported the idea, noting the money could be saved for future purchases like this truck, for instance. Mr. Nestick also supported the idea, liking that the vehicle tax supports the streets department, which seemed appropriate. Mr. Whitehill spoke against the idea and didn't like imposing a tax right when the voters were about to be asked to support a tax increase. I agreed with Mr. Whitehill's position on this, and I thank Mrs. Brothers for her research. Mr. Nestick made a motion to increase the permissive use tax. There was no second, and it failed. It was decided to place this information in the back burner for now. Ohio Public Works Commission grants and/or low-interest loans. Mrs. Brothers explained there are grants and/or low or zero-interest loans specifically for storm sewage water runoff projects that the city may want to apply for. She explained that John Vonagel can apply for these, but that the process needs to get underway. The committee agreed and gave permission for House and Baird to put a proposal together. Finally, approved appropriations. The committee agreed to send an appropriations ordinance onto council. It is before you tonight. Most notably on that is more money for the streets paving program has become available. $140,000 that had been set aside in capital improvements for the snowplow that will now be financed, and $110,000 set aside for the roof will now come out of the general fund, which frees up $250,000. This, along with the $250,000 that had been previously earmarked but put on hold, has been released, bringing the total available for this year's street paving projects to $500,000. That concludes my report, Mr. President. I have several ordinances and resolutions this evening, which I already have numbers for. I don't know whether you want to go over them again or not.
We will go over those
Thank
again.
you.
The ordinance dealing with the appropriations and transfers, that will be number 36. The ordinance dealing with the loan from the Utilities Department as to the 2.5-ton dump truck will be number 37. The advertising bids on the new roof ordinance will be number 38. The ordinance dealing with the tax increase, that will be number 39, and the resolution, which is dealing with that also, is a resolution number 40. That is for forwarding it on to the Board of Elections, is why we have the two different ones with regards to that. Thank you, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you.
Streets, alleys, and sidewalks, Mr. Paparotis.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Utilities, Mr. Brown.
My committee has not met, and I have no report.
Traffic and safety, Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report.
Rules and ordinances, Mrs. Dickey.
My committee has not met, and I have no report. Thank you.
Parks, Mr. Drummond.
The Parks Committee has not met. I have no report. Thank you.
All right, anybody on economic development? Was there any? I don't believe there was any meeting.
No meeting.
All right. And Committee of the Whole, is anybody filling in for Mr. Nestick? Mr. Whitehill?
Formal minutes have not been prepared yet. The Committee of the Whole did meet. There was a lengthy discussion as it related to the K-9 units, 1 versus 2, and possible funding solutions. Mr. Drummond committed to look into the cost and options for the K-9 units, possible community support for funding it. And then there were multiple motions made, 2 of which were for property tax increase of 0.25%. Those both as temporary 5-year and permanent both died for lack of a second. And then for the third, it was approved forward to council tonight for a permanent 0.25%.
Right. Very good. That concludes the reports of standing committees. We have no second and third readings of ordinances and resolutions this evening. Therefore, we'll move on to the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before us is ordinance 36, an appropriations ordinance. I would like to make a motion to amend that to remove section 3.
Right, and also then change the following sections to the numbers of 3 and 4 as opposed to 4 and 5?
Thank you.
All right. Is there a second with regards to that? That was the language that Mrs. Brothers, for those that were listening to her, indicated that was on the last one, shouldn't be here, just wasn't removed when it was prepared. So we have a motion. Mr. Paparotis, second. The clerk pro tem would call the roll, please.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
I vote yes, 6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, thank you. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move to suspend council rules so that ordinance number 36 can be considered tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mr. Brown? The clerk pro tem would please call the roll.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Yes, 6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move to suspend statutory rules so that ordinance number 36 can be read for the first, second, and third reading tonight.
Okay, is there a second on that? Mr. Brown? The clerk pro tem would please call the roll.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move that the clerk read ordinance number 36 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, would the clerk pro tem please read ordinance number 36 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with the emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing appropriations and transfers as set forth below and declaring an emergency.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Dickey?
The money that we're asking to take from the general fund to do the roof, first of all, my question is that normally how it's done when we don't have the bids in and know how much it's going to cost first? And also, what are we taking the money from in the general fund to move that money for the roof? What are we going to lose?
Mr. Brothers, if you would, so it's picked up on the mic, thank you.
The way that it's appropriated is there's extra money in the general fund that's not appropriated for anything. So this is just an extra $110,000. Like, for example, last month, our income tax receipts were over $100,000 over. Obviously, that wasn't budgeted for, so we're just taking the excess money out of the general and appropriating it for the roof in the city hall portion. And the reason why it's budgeted for 110 is because prior to the last finance meeting that we had, we only had one bid, which was the state purchasing bid. And at the finance meeting, they had asked to have at least 3 bids. So Mr. Kent's received 3 bids, and that's like the average. None of them was over 110,000. Since it's no longer purchasing from the state purchasing program, because the materials is no longer part of it, we actually have to now go out and bid for it. And with those 3 bids, none of them were over 110, so that's why we, safe to say, that's 110,000 we're gonna budget appropriate for the roof. It may not be that much, and we won't use that much. Okay?
I would also like to ask, our budget for this year included the contingency fund for council, which is now up to, what, over $100,000?
It's about 160 something, right?
Have we given any consideration into giving that back? Is it show of good faith for the citizens of the city to get more roads done this year while we're looking into a tax?
I know Mr. Cushman had brought that up, but it has not gone in front of a committee of the whole or council to do that. If council decides to do that, it very easily can be appropriated into the general fund. It could be transferred. I'm sorry, capital improvement. It could be easily transferred. So that's up to all of you to decide whether or not you want to do that.
Mr. President.
Mr.
Mrs.
Cushman.
Dickey, that's a very good point. And aside of gray hair, I also have memory loss. I intended to mention that at each of the committee of the whole meetings that we've had and get sidetracked and I haven't. Either the next committee of the whole meeting or the next finance committee meeting that we have, that'll be on the agenda. Great idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mrs. Brothers?
Mr. President, not a question for Betty, but just a comment that there is a finite amount of time for preparing the drawings that are going to go out for bid. So if you intend to do that, I would ask that you have your meeting soon so I know how to proceed. So that's all I'd like to say.
Mr. Drummond.
Just one thing on that council contingency fund, we do have monies that we have committed to the chamber.
Exactly.
For signs, so we can't get rid of everything. Just
No,
keep
and
that in
then, of
mind.
course, you have the appropriated for the TCA as well. We couldn't touch that, nor I believe it's 21,000 for the signs, 3,000 from each one.
I think it's like
Right.
130,000 that's sitting there. Yeah,
Right.
I think.
And that would go a long way on our roads.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Any other questions for Mrs. Brothers with regards to this? All right, thank you. Any further discussion as to ordinance number 36? Seeing none, would the clerk pro tem then please call the roll as to ordinance number 36 for passage this evening?
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, ordinance number 36 passes with 6 yeas. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move to suspend statutory rules so that ordinance number 37 can be read for the first, second, and third reading tonight.
Is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey. Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
Statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that the clerk pro tem read ordinance number 37 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, would the clerk pro tem please read ordinance number 37 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance to provide for the issuance and sale of not to exceed $100,000 of notes of the city of Salem in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of acquiring, equipping, and otherwise improving a 2.5-ton dump truck, including all necessary appurtenances thereto, and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion on ordinance number 37? Seeing none, would the clerk pro tem please call the roll on ordinance number 37 for passage this evening?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, ordinance number 37 passes with 6 yeas. Mr. Cushman.
President, I move to suspend the statutory rules so that ordinance number 38 can be read for the first, second, and third reading tonight.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Brown, Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that the clerk pro tem read ordinance number 38 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, would the clerk pro tem please read ordinance number 38 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into contract for a new roof on the Salem City Hall building and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Mr. Drummond?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Kent, I assume there's warranties on this work? How long?
Well, the 3 bids I have.
Ken, if you would come down just so it's picked up, please. Thank you.
I believe in the specifications that are going to be drawn up, there's going to be a minimum of 15 years, labor and material.
Thank you.
Any other questions or discussion with regards to ordinance number 38? Seeing none, would the clerk pro tem then please call the roll on ordinance number 38 for passage this evening?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right. Ordinance number 38 passes with 6 yeas. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I would like to, in regards to ordinance number 39, make a motion to add the words "for a 5-year period" at the end of the sentence that says 1/4% effective January 1st, 2016. I would like to add for a 5-year period. I'd like to make that motion.
All right. I would think that in the language that we normally read, that you would want it in there prior, right after the 1/4% and prior to declaring an emergency also.
Yes.
All right, I think
down
those
in
are the only 2 places that.
I believe there's a third,
Is there? All
Mr.
right.
President. On this, no, that's in the resolution. There was just, under section 1, is that what you're referring to?
Section 1 and then
On the ordinance, under section 1, there's also the effective January 6th,
yes,
1st, 2016.
there and then down there.
Yes, sir.
All right, we have a motion to amend those 2 areas. Mrs. Dickey seconds. Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
5 yea votes, Mr. President.
All right, it's so amended then. Mr. Cushman.
With that, Mr. President, I move the council suspend council rules so that ordinance number 39 can be considered tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mr. Brown? Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
And council rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move to suspend the statutory rules so that ordinance number 39 can be read for the first, second, third readings tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
5 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, with that, then, we don't have the necessary 6 votes to do that. It can be given its first reading this evening, then, Mr. Cushman. Is that what you're asking for, then?
That's right, it has to be, yes, that's what I'm asking for then.
All right. Would the clerk pro tem please read ordinance 39 by title only for its first reading this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance pursuant to Ohio Revised Code, Section 718.01, authorizing a levy to increase the income tax 1/4% effective January 1st, 2016 for capital improvement and expenditures specifically for the maintenance and repair of streets, alleys, sidewalks, curbs, storm sewers in the city of Salem, with said increase resulting in a collective levy on income tax of 1 1/4%, declaring emergency, and we did add the 5-year expiration on that as well.
All right, very good. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, in regard to resolution number 40, we would like to add the same language, adding the statement for a 5-year period. I believe in this case it was 3 places on this resolution.
All right, if you would point those out, please, for
Thank
the
you.
members.
The very first section, and the very first paragraph, all in bold, where it ends with January 1st, 2016, would add for a 5-year period. Second place is down below, the third whereas paragraph, also to be added at the end of the January 1st, 2016, for a 5-year period. And finally, on the last page, the back page, the top paragraph, again, at the end of the sentence ending in January 1st, 2016, for a 5-year period.
All right, we have a motion as those 2 places. Mrs. Dickey seconds that. Would the clerk pro tem please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
5 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, motion carries. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move that resolution 40, I move that the clerk pro tem read resolution 40 by title only for its first reading.
Are we going to suspend the council
I'm sorry, my
rules
apologies.
first? That's all right.
Mr. President, I move to suspend the council rule so that resolution 40 can be considered tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? If the clerk pro tem would please call the roll.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, council rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move that clerk pro tem read resolution 40 by title only for its first reading.
All right, would the clerk pro tem please read resolution number 40 by title only for its first reading this evening with emergency clause?
Being a resolution directing the Columbiana County, Ohio Board of Elections to place upon the ballot at the general election on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2015, the question of whether there shall be levied an additional 1/4% on income earned in the city of Salem, effective January 1st, 2016, for a period of 5 years for capital improvement expenditures specifically for the maintenance and repair of streets, alleys, sidewalks, curbs, and storm sewers in the city of Salem, with said increase resulting in a collective levy on income tax of 1 1/4% and declaring an emergency.
Very good. That concludes then the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. Therefore moves to the pleasure of council. Mrs. Dickey.
Before we get into pleasure of council, could I make a motion that we set a special council meeting so that we can have the second reading on this? Because we're on a deadline on this tax issue.
Well, that would, with that, I guess that at our next meeting, if it were to pass at that time, if it were given the second and third readings, then there would be the time to get that to the Board of Elections, which is August 3rd, with regards to that. At that point in time, could always call for another meeting very quickly, give the notice. That's up to the council.
Is everyone here going to be available? Because I'd hate to get down to the deadline and not have a quorum.
well, I don't know this. Worse, I haven't been on council yet, sitting as a council member that where we haven't had a quorum.
We came close once.
Close, but hasn't happened. We can discuss that afterwards, and then I'll take that into consideration of doing that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I would just like to remind everyone that we're having the bike rally this weekend, starting on Thursday, and there are a lot of different events, even if you are not a biker. And it should be really interesting to see all the beautiful bikes in the contests for the different classes, and it's a lot like the show and shine for the cars. It's kind of interesting. There are some strange and new breeds out there in motorcycles. And I would also like to thank everybody who did come out in the rain for the cruise.
Very good. Mr. Drummond?
Thank you, Mr. President. On the tax issue, I just want to go on record as, in the committee of the whole meeting, I was one of the individuals that supported a permanent increase of 0.25%. Personally, I feel that in 5 years' time, we'll still have enough work to do that we would need those funds. Since then, however, the feedback I've been receiving is that that will not pass, and I look at it now that we need to do something. If not, if we can't get it permanently, we need at least to get it for 5 years. If we don't get it done, the work that we need to get done by the end of 5 years, we may, and Mr. Cahill, I hope is correct in that we'll have increased the tax base, but if we have not, we will probably be coming back to the voters to do this all over again. So with that in mind, I will support a 0.25% increase as a 5-year when that next vote comes up. Although I still, in my heart, feel that permanent would be better for the things that we need to get done in the city. But if that's not going to pass, there's no sense. Let's get something done that will pass. So I just wanted that out there for one. I hope that the bike weekend is successful. Unfortunately, I won't be here for that, not because of the weather. I'm heading back to Canada to bury my mom. She passed away in December. I didn't think it was going to hit me this hard. A wonderful woman. She raised 3.5 great kids. The oldest brother, he better not see this tape. No, we all came out well, and we miss her dearly. That's all, Mr. President.
Very good. Mr. Brown?
I'll keep it short and sweet, maybe 3 minutes at the most. But my family and I want to thank the Salem Regional Medical Center for their outstanding concern and treatment I received from June 26th through July 2nd. On June 25th, I received an email stating the tapes of April 6th and April 13th of the BOZA sessions were taken to former Mayor Jerry Wolford to be copied. I had been told previously the tapes could not be removed from City Hall due to an administrative rule. On Sunday, the 28th, I read the front page article, copies of tapes made. Great emphasis was put on getting the tapes copied, and that it cost the city a whole $40. Since my first request for public records that I sent to Mr. Morrissey, no one has asked me outright why I wanted copies of the sessions. No one has asked me what I intend to do with them. I've already scheduled a meeting for Tuesday, July 28th at 6:30 p.m. at the Courtyard Square downtown. Second Ward and all other concerned residents of Salem are welcome to attend. I have several issues to discuss, including why I got involved with the expansion of the Salem Community Center, why I requested copies of the tapes of the Board of Zoning Appeals meetings, update on the scrapyard in West Perkins Street, last but not least, not possibly the last item, that I'm very concerned about enforcing and compliance with ordinance of the City of Salem. Everyone present will have the opportunity to express their concern and participate in discussions. Thank you.
All right, very good. Mr. Whitehill?
Thank you, Mr. President. As an additional comment in regards to the tax, when I ran for this office originally, I committed to myself and anyone I spoke to that I would vote on principle. The great thing about a representative republic is that we are in that situation to vote for what we think is best for the town overall. and I'm okay with being a minority on that one because I know that it's what I'm comfortable with what I believe is going to be needed, and for the folks that support it temporary, I respect that. There's also some other people that I respect very much who support it as a permanent change. So I'm not just being an obstructionist. I am voting my conscience and what I believe is best for this community. On a lighter note, I know a guy who has put in effort to the entertainment, maybe even more so than me, for the bike event, so we're looking very much forward to that and getting some good musicians on the stage. And so we hope for good weather and a great, safe, well-populated turnout for that. And if they're not on sale already, tickets will be on sale soon for the Oliver production at Salem Community Theater. There is a cast of approximately 65 people. And yes, I have a vested interest because 3 of them are White Hills. But there's a lot of hard work going on. It's going to be a very special production, and Mark Frost is directing it, and very excited for that. So.
Very good. Mr. Paparotis.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just hope everybody comes out for Bike Week. Lots of bands Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Should be a great time.
Okay. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too would like to echo the sentiments and comments on the Bike Week and thank Rob Johnson for his vision, having the courage to come in here with that idea and the fortitude to see it to this point. And I wish him and his committee all the very, very best, and ask that everyone from Salem come out and surrounding communities come out and support this, and let's make this as wonderful of an event as we possibly can. Finally, a comment on the tax. It looks like we are headed to have a tax on the ballot this fall. I would like to thank everyone in this room for their help and their assistance. I understand there are 4 people who are up for re-election, not to mention a mayor and an auditor, and the risk that they take even speaking about it. No one likes a tax, no one wants a tax, but it is time that we step forward and we help our community. Our parents, grandparents did it. It's now our turn to step up and dig into our pockets and help make our city better. Together we will do that. And I once again want to thank you all for that support.
All right, thank you. Rob, good luck with the Bike Week. I think everybody is behind you on that. As to the tax, I made my comments known before that I was for the permanent tax because I think that you have to look at long-term planning. In 5 years, you really can't say, okay, we're going to do this, because at the end of the 5 years, hopefully, you can get the voters to support that. Again, that's why I looked at it as permanent, being able to do more with regards to that. Regardless, either way, I will be behind it, and I think that the council members, it's one thing to sit here and talk about it. It's one thing to go out on the streets and talk about it, but I think that it's going to take us going door to door, knocking on doors, explaining things to people, and I will be there doing that. I'm not up for election, but you would think I will be, because I'll be out there knocking on those doors, trying to get those votes. That's all I have tonight. Meeting's adjourned.
I'm running myself in the ground. Thank you.